What is up, everyone? Welcome to the first episode of our in-depth preview of each NFL team heading into the 2017 season. We got a couple months to go before training camps start, so we're going to hopefully get about 2 or 3 of these videos out a week, hopefully get something consistent that you can look forward to. And it'll be a little longer than some of the team reviews that I've done in the past. Basically, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about each team's power ranking, a quick review, how I think they'll do. Then we're going to take a deep dive into the depth chart and really talk about who's fighting for jobs, what the starting rosters are going to look like potentially after training camp and the preseason. Then we're going to talk some fantasy football, which I haven't done a ton of on this channel, but it's something that I spend a lot of time looking into and thinking about, and I want to start talking about that on the channel. So we're going to look at average draft position of pretty much every relevant player and talk about if I like where they're going, if I would reach for them, maybe I'm staying away from the guy. And yeah, so we'll go through fantasy, and then we'll take a look at the Vegas odds of these teams, team over-unders, playoff odds, that sort of thing, and then we'll wrap up. So I'm looking forward to doing these series, and I hope you guys like it. Starting now with the 32nd team, it is the New York Jets. Now, I think this team has a little more direction than some of these other teams that we'll see towards the bottom, which will be revealed later. But I think looking 3 years down the road, we might say the Jets kind of knew what they were doing at this point. They are purging the veterans from this roster. They know they aren't going to be able to compete, at least for a Super Bowl, obviously. But they seem to be tanking, with the news of Eric Decker about to be released, which may or may not happen by the time this video gets published. But I think they at least know where they are. They're going to test out these rookies, and really, by the end of this year, I think they're going to have a good grasp going forward, kind of like what we saw with the 49ers last season. So now we're going to take a look at these depth charts. Starting at the quarterback, it's Josh McCown on top. I think we'll see McCown start maybe the first 4 to 6 weeks. I like his game a lot. It's just he's pretty old. He's like 37. So they might keep him in there just to see if they can compete with him. They won't be able to compete with him. This roster is not good enough. And they have the Patriots lurking in that division. Then you go down, technically Bryce Petty listed as the backup. I actually am way more intrigued by Christian Hackenberg, and I believe that's sort of where their front office is as well. Bryce Petty, I'm not really a big fan of Big 12 quarterbacks. He talked about how he didn't really know even, I think, like what a cover 2 was coming out until he played Madden. Hackenberg coming out of the Big 10, a better athlete, better arm, and I honestly could see him developing, and I know that they have faith in him, at least some faith, as they took him in the second round, and they're definitely going to want to see what they have in him for sure. If they're going to have a top 2 or 3 pick next year in a really good quarterback class, they're going to need to get some starts out of Hackenberg, get some clarity on if they can go forward with him or if they need to bring in another guy like Sam Darnold. Onto the running backs, Matt Forte at the top. I still love Matt Forte, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the fantasy section. He's a clear-cut Hall of Famer to me. He's just so steady, doesn't get injured. I know he missed a few games last year, but he still is just a steady hand, can do everything. Might be slowing down, but I'm not so impressed with Bilal Powell, who's next, that I think Powell's going to just blow away Matt Forte, especially with his athleticism. They will definitely split carries. I think it'll be about 60-40, which, again, we'll talk more about that in fantasy. I do like them both. They're both going to play. But then after that, it's really not much. I mean, Elijah McGuire, drafted in the 6th round out of Louisiana Lafayette. Brandon Wilds, Romar Morris, just some guys that probably won't become much. I'm not a huge fan of any of those guys. And then onto the receivers, this group is honestly really exciting, probably the most exciting part of this Jets depth chart. Obviously, Eric Decker still sitting there at the top, but it looks like he will be on his way out, which we'll talk about Decker in the fantasy section, where he might land. And there's a chance he's landed by the time this video comes out. Sharon Peak, actually Quincy Enunwa is listed next. I like Enunwa. Really big physical player. Profile's more like a tight end. Doesn't have a ton of quickness, but really good straight line speed. Could potentially be a really good number two. I don't know if he could take over as that number one receiver. And then Sharon Peak listed second on the depth chart. Now he profiles more like a number one receiver, still very raw, but kind of similar to a guy like Martavis Bryant, out of Clemson, just like Peak is. Just a big, strong, fast guy. Pretty raw though. And then the rest of these guys too is all pretty athletic. Ardarius Stewart, third round out of Alabama. I like him a lot, but he is raw. Didn't really get used too much in the offense there. Robbie Anderson, another good athlete, along with Jalen Marshall, both undrafted rookies last year that did well with the playing time they got. Chad Hansen, drafted out of California in the fourth round, probably at best going to be like a Marvin Jones. And then Miles White and Chris Harper will probably be the guys competing for that sixth spot. Devin Street also on the roster, along with a group of other guys. And then at tight end, they have Jordan Leggett, was drafted in the fifth round. He's okay. I would have been more excited if they went with a guy like Bucky Hodges with that pick. I just like Hodges as a receiver a little better. Leggett potentially a little bit better at blocking. But Austin Safarian Jenkins is listed after that. I'm done believing in Jenkins. He doesn't really seem to get it, but you never know with these guys. And in general, the Jets just don't use this tight end position too often. And then just some veterans listed there after those two. And now, quickly going through the offensive line, it's not the best group, but at least the guards are solid in Brian Winters and James Carpenter. They're going to have to find their left tackle. They're going to have to find their center. Wesley Johnson looks to be starting there, but they did bring in Jonathan Harrison from the Colts, I believe, and Kelvin Beachum should plug right in and start at right tackle. Now, moving on to the defensive side of the ball, this is kind of a complicated scheme. Are they a 3-4? Are they a 4-3? It's the same thing we see in Arizona. They just don't have nearly the personnel that they have there. So they have Leonard Williams and Steve McClendon, Muhammad Wilkerson, a great D-line, still one of the best D-lines in football. And they're going to be able to compete against the right matchups in certain games just because of that front line. They're going to really be able to dominate some teams. If they play a team like Denver or Minnesota, they're going to be able to dominate the line of scrimmage and make those games really tough on certain teams. But in general, not great pass rushers, just really good line controllers. And then they have Sheldon Richardson listed as an outside linebacker. I think that's a huge reason why he struggled so much, along with off-the-field issues. He does come up in my Madden rating just because I do think this scheme is a terrible fit for him. He should be an outside DN, but they just don't have room for him with Wilkerson and Williams. So they move him outside. They try to do what they can with him, but he's a free agent coming up, and I think he's going to have a career resurgence with a different team, especially if he can get to a winning team where he really wants to try. The depth is okay. They have Mike Pennell coming over from Green Bay, Deion Simon, Anthony Johnson, Lawrence Thomas, just some rotational guys. And then the outside linebacker position, we talked about Richardson a little bit. This is by far the weakest part of this team. A couple third-round picks in Jordan Jenkins and Lorenzo Malden have not really panned out. I think I like Malden more than Jenkins, but man, do they lack that edge rusher. And I'm surprised they didn't hit this harder in the draft. Maybe they feel better about this position than I do, but that's going to have to be a huge point of emphasis. Not really much depth behind those guys either. And then moving into the inside, Darren Lee, kind of a disappointing first-round pick from last year. He's still going to start, though. And Demario Davis just acquired from Cleveland, and they cut David. So we'll see. I think those guys will be pretty solid on the inside and not a ton of depth inside there. Their linebackers in general is just very weak, along with their secondary. Not the best. They do bring in Morris Claiborne, who's honestly probably going to be a better version of what Darrelle Revis was last year. Had a pretty good year in Dallas, but then dropped off a little towards the end. Buster Screen, good undersized corner. Marcus Williams, kind of a ball hawking corner, okay in coverage, and not much good depth after that. And at safety, Jamal Adams going to plug right in. Should be a stud, maybe even a star. We'll see. Known for his locker room presence, could be sort of that Earl Thomas leader on their defense down the road, even if he isn't the athlete Earl Thomas is. And then at free safety, we're going to have a competition between Rontez Miles and Marcus May, the second round pick out of Florida. So, yeah, that concludes the depth chart look for the Jets. So, moving on to fantasy football and the relevance for these players on the Jets, starting at quarterback, none of them are ranked for average draft position or ADP on fantasyfootballcalculator.com. Josh McCown, I would consider in a deep two quarterback league as a depth guy. He probably will start to begin the year. And then Christian Hackenberg is interesting for a dynasty if it's a deeper dynasty, anything north of 12 teams and obviously multiple quarterbacks, which I am an advocate for, by the way. Other than that, I mean, Hackenberg will get a chance, but there's a slim chance that he's actually good. I do like the receivers he'll be throwing to, but it's kind of a shot out there for Christian Hackenberg. At running back, Bilal Powell going 31st, actually 31st of running backs, 10 picks ahead of Matt Forte, who's going 41st of running backs in the middle of the 10th round, Powell going late 7th. I'm not touching Bilal Powell in the 7th round, mainly because I actually think Forte is going to have a better statistical year than Powell. I think it'll be about a 60-40 split. I get that Powell is younger, probably a little more athletic than Forte at this point, but Forte is just such a steady hand, a Hall of Fame caliber running back in my opinion, and he still played pretty damn well last year. That said, I don't love either of them. There's not a whole lot of relevance here, not a lot of touchdowns to be scored on the Jets, but I think Forte ends up probably around that 800-yard mark. Will probably catch about 40 balls and score about 6 touchdowns. Powell would be slightly less than that. And then Elijah McGuire, deep dynasty flyer, hoping for injury. I don't love his talent, but sometimes we see opportunity wins out in fantasy football if there were injuries ahead of him. And then at wide receiver, still, again, not a ton of relevance, but Eric Decker needs to be talked about. Should he get released, he's going as the 42nd wide receiver in the 11th round. If you're drafting today, I say why not? Take a flyer on Decker. If I had to bet, I would say he'll end up in Baltimore. That would be a great fit. He could easily score 10 touchdowns in Baltimore with 1,000 yards just on target volume alone. And then Decker leaving is definitely good for Quincy Enunwa. Enunwa going in the 14th round as the 66th wide receiver. We saw him produce pretty well last year, and if he's the number one target on this offense that is probably going to be trailing late in games, the 66th wide receiver is great value for Enunwa. I know that he's going to climb up and probably into the late 40s, which is honestly still not a terrible value for Enunwa. I bet he finishes the year as a bottom end wide receiver 3, which getting him at the 66th spot right now is fantastic. And then the other guys outside of a dynasty league, you're not really going to consider any of these guys. Maybe Ardarius Stewart has that upside. I think I like Sharon Peak better right now. Just he's got an extra year under his belt. And then Jalen Marshall and Robbie Anderson are going to make things complicated too. They're going to have to get reps in there as well. But yeah, I think Peak and Stewart, you can kind of take your pick in terms of a dynasty. Stewart's going to be more popular, but I think Peak is a guy that is going to get overlooked. And Peak honestly did impress with some targets last year. And then at tight end, you're probably not drafting anyone here. Maybe in a deeper dynasty format, you would look at Jordan Leggett, but I think long term they're going to have to find another option. I don't see Jordan Leggett as a steady tight end. He reminds me a little bit of Richard Rodgers, maybe a little faster. And then I'm not a believer in Austin Seferian-Jenkins. And the defense, I'm not touching this defense. The offense is going to be in a lot of 3-and-outs, putting too much pressure on this defense. And they don't really have any playmakers to get those big defensive touchdowns. So that's going to wrap up the fantasy look for the Jets. So we're going to conclude now just looking at the Vegas odds. So the Super Bowl odds for the Jets are 200-1. No chance in hell I'm taking that. Even at those odds, there's just no way with the quarterback situation and everything there that they win a Super Bowl. The division is 33-1. I guess more realistic. I guess, maybe something happens to Tom Brady early in the year, but the Bills and the Dolphins aren't terrible. And then their over-under is at 5. And simply for the fact that I think this team wants to lose, I definitely will go under on that. I think they will end up winning about 3 games and ending up in that top 5 for picks. So that's going to conclude our look here at the Jets. As we go through this series, if there's stuff that I'm missing, whether it's about a team or just in general the content here, if there's stuff you want me to be talking about that I'm not, please do comment. I do read the comments. Or you can hit me up on Twitter at @TFG_football. And I appreciate it, everyone. We'll see you for the next one.